This podcast has been brought to you by GM Moving, part of Greater Sport. We're here to help the people of Greater Manchester get moving and to improve lives through physical activity.
Hi, I'm Eve Holt, Strategic Director at GM Moving. Welcome to the last episode of our Keep GM Moving podcast series. I hope you've enjoyed our COVID conversations as much as I have. We're finishing the series with a really important conversation exploring what we can do to tackle racism in sport and physical activity and enable our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in Greater Manchester to live more active lives, bridging the gap in activity levels between ethnicities which currently contribute to huge health inequalities. For this conversation, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by two of our Greater Sport trustees, Paula Dunn and Sanjay Bandari. Paula Dunn, formerly Thomas, is well known as a former sprinter who represented Great Britain in the 100 metres, 200 metres and 100 metres relay, achieving 5 Commonwealth Games medals. Paula grew up in Manchester and trained at the Trafford Athletics Club just down the road from me in Stretford. Paula is now the Paralympic head coach at British Athletics, making her the first female para-athletics head coach and the first BAME head coach, having been employed by British Athletics since 2001 after 16 years working for Manchester City Council. In 2019, Paula Dunn was awarded an MBE for her services to athletics. She joined the Greater Sport Board to improve the sport, health and well-being for all communities. I've really enjoyed her expertise and her down-to-earth approach as a member of our board. Sanjay holds a number of advisor, trustee and board roles, to include his role on the Greater Sport Board and being a chair of the football anti-discrimination charity Kick It Out. His background in professional services as a lawyer and then consultant included a time being actively involved in EY's diversity and inclusion strategies, sponsoring and leading many of their award-winning race and ethnicity activities. He is a member of the government-backed Park Review on Ethnicity and UK boards. Sanjay joined the Greater Sport Board to make a difference to people's lives, having personally seen the value of exercise and physical activity when dealing with anxiety. So, over to them. Thank you both for joining me today for today's podcast. And obviously I know both of you as trustees at Greater Sport, but you have a whole life and a whole lot of work that you do outside of that role. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about you, about your roles, as well as your relationship to Greater Sport. So over to you first, Paula.
Hello, so my name's Paula Dunn. As you say, I am a trustee on the Greater Sport Board and I have been for nearly 6 years. My day job, I am the head coach of the Para-Athletics programme and employed by British Athletics, and now currently getting ready for Tokyo next year, which is obviously delayed due to the pandemic. So that's me.
And I'm Sanjay Bandari. I'm also a trustee of Greater Sport, not as experienced as Paula. I've only been on the board for about a year. I had a sort of 30-year career in professional services, law, technology, compliance, innovation. But I sort of retired from that last year, and I have a portfolio career, a bunch of other things I do. Most of the last year I've been taking off and doing charity work. So one of the other charities I'm heavily involved with is Kick It Out. I'm the chair of Kick It Out, which is football's leading anti-discrimination charity and tackling discrimination and promoting inclusion.
So I really wanted to talk today about tackling racism within sport and physical activity, and also broadly about how we help prevent a widening of the gap and in fact close the gap in terms of the current difference there is in activity levels between ethnicities, which really results in some huge health inequalities, as have been very starkly highlighted and amplified during COVID. So we know that those of South Asian or Black ethnicities are reported to be less active than other ethnicities, and there are larger gaps for some than for others, as well as all the other intersecting barriers to physical activity, be that gender, your class or socioeconomic background, a disability, sexuality, all of which of course layer on to create these huge barriers, don't they, to being active. And as well as that, there are these bias and racism within the physical activity sector, which continue to prevail, and we have to be very honest, don't we, about the challenge we've got to tackle that. So coming to you first, Sanjay, can you just tell us a little bit about why tackling racism in sport physical activity is important to you and how you've been involved in seeking to bring about change?
Yeah, so why is it important to me? I suppose at a very simple, practical level, I'm chairman of Kick It Out, and so as for that, the objective of that charity is to eradicate discrimination and racism from football, and it's been around for a very long time. I suppose more personally, I'm a massive football fan and have been for 46 years, and I've been going to football for 30 plus years, and so I've seen changes in football in particular and sport in more general. But as an example, I mean, I'll see now many more people that look like me watching a game, but I don't see anyone that looks like me on a pitch. I see lots of black people on a pitch. There'll be lots of black players, but I don't see them in a dugout. And then when I go into a boardroom, I don't see anyone really. It's all mostly white and male. So it's important to me personally because I'm a big sports fan and I'm a big football fan, and so wanting to see a game that represents the community at large is important to me. And some of these inequalities are systemic and have been there for 40 plus years. So the white male boardrooms, absence of complete invisibility of Asians, and the absence of black coaches, those are persistent despite all the improvements. Those have been there for 40 years. And I suppose in physical activity, it's important because coming from a South Asian background, actually physical activity was never prized as a child when I was growing up, not something that we were really encouraged to do from a family background. But I found, particularly from a personal perspective, dealing with mental health issues and addiction issues, that physical activity was a key part of my recovery from things like that, and so they became a really important thing for me to do personally, and I can see the value of it. And so in terms of what I've been involved in, well, really a lot of that, particularly around Kick It Out, been working with the FA very much over the last few weeks on their Equality in Football Leadership voluntary code that we're aiming to launch in early October, and that's taking up quite a lot of time at the moment, because that is about how we set targets for better representation in coaching and senior leadership in the game. So that's probably the biggest, most high profile thing that I've been involved in over the last few weeks.
So we talk a lot, don't we, about you can't be what you can't see. So what you've suggested there, Sanjay, is some of the progress in terms of maybe who's watching or appreciating and participating in sport, but certainly we need more progress when it comes to who we see in the boardroom and who we see on the pitch and in other spaces. So Paula, absolutely. I remember watching you as an athlete, as a black woman. I remember that distinctly growing up. So, you've certainly been a huge role model, I'm sure, for lots of people out there. So can you share for you why tackling racism in sport and physical activity, why is it important to you? And again, as well as being a role model, the other ways that you've been involved in seeking to bring about change.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what Sanjay said. It's not unusual to see, black people competing and people of colour competing in a variety of sports. But as soon as you go up to the next level of those people, employed as coaches or in the boardroom, it becomes less and less. So to me, I think it's all about profile. People need to see somebody that looks like them to aspire to get to a position. I think what surprised me was the report that was published that was only one black person on a board in any NGBs that were funded by UK Sport. I think that's something that definitely needs to be rectified ASAP, because the number of people of colour competing within the NGB sports and those Olympic sports are huge. So yeah, we are seeing progress and we are getting more role models. But for real change to happen, you need to make sure you have diversity of four on board, because they're the people that will make the big decisions that will impact long term. So yeah, you'll get the short term of somebody competing when you see the TV switched on. But the ones to make big system changes are all done through where the power is held, which is at the board level. So yeah, so I think like most people, during the pandemic, as a black person, when we saw the impact of COVID, that was to me very telling that, yeah, we've kind of just done things on the surface, but real change for people down in the community hasn't really had the impact that people were saying or what we thought. So, whether it was somebody's racial profile, whether it was their level of access to community stuff or their finance background, female disability, I think it all became very aware that the people that we probably knew were struggling to access physical activity or sport were the ones that were most impacted. So I think it just means that we have to have a real complete shift in how we approach this, because it was obviously very clear during the pandemic that the people who suffered most are probably the people we would have expected pre-pandemic as well.
Absolutely. So as you know, at Greater Sport, we take a whole system approach to thinking about how we make that population level change for more active lives. And we're applying the same when it comes to tackling inequalities, and then very specifically thinking about how we help close the gap in terms of number of people who are people of colour who are living active lives, and how we recognise, the different layers across the whole system that need to really make a shift across each of those. So you made reference there, I know Sanjay, you referred to some of the kind of cultural barriers that exist, again, that are different for different ethnicities and have been different, have changed and evolved, but for you growing up as a child where physical activity wasn't prized. And then also some of the then kind of the hard rules or the policies, the opportunities in setting like hard targets, for example, so that we really make those shifts within the boardroom, and the things that we can do, can't we, to really set some clear kind of targets to help make those changes happen. And then there's all the other layers. So, the physical environment. Runnymede did a really good piece of research, again, looking at, people's access to green spaces, whether they feel safe to go outside and be physically active. All of course were really important during COVID. And we know that you're someone of colour, you're far less likely to be able to access safe green space and to feel that you can go out and go for a run or go for a walk without potentially being a victim. So are there any specific barriers or challenges that you would like to highlight, or equally any kind of successes, any good examples where you are seeing progress against those layers that you want to point to?
I think so. Well, first of all, I think we have to be really careful that we don't actually put some preconceived ideas about why people don't do activity. I always think we need to ask that population, what are their barriers? I think sometimes it's easy for us to assume it's lack of interest, lack of access to facilities, especially in the Greater Manchester area where I'm actually based. There's a local park, and these in all areas. I live in Salford, my family live in Charlton and Whalley Range. There is local parks. So I think sometimes it's a little bit easier to say, is it finance? Is it lack of interest? So I always say you go to the source and ask those people within those communities, what do they want? What do they need? What do they feel the barriers are? Rather than assuming that we've got the answer. So that would be my big message, is that always go to the source and don't presume. Because sometimes I think presumptions leads to putting a scheme on, you get some interest, and then that scheme shuts down because it wasn't theirs. They didn't buy into it, so they don't value it. So for people to value and to make real behaviour change, they've got to feel that they're part of the process and that what's being done is what they require. So I think that would be my strong force. But for example, I've seen, and my son goes in Alexander Park in Moss Side, a community group has just started up doing exercises like circuit training. It happens on a Tuesday and Thursday. My brother goes along, my son goes along, and that's 40 to 50 people are going there every Tuesday and Thursday. It's very informal. Different people take the sessions, but it's just running circuit sessions. And that's something that they did by themselves. Nobody assumed that, so the community started it. They put it on, they were interested in it, and it's just grown. And it's very informal, and I suspect there'll be quite a lot of informal things happening that we're not aware of. So I think sometimes we do need to take a step back and not presume that it's sometimes lack of interest or access to finance. Sometimes it's just finding what do they need and what do they want.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Paul has said. I think we shouldn't make assumptions. There's that old phrase that assume makes an ass out of you and me, and there's a truth to that. So actually going and asking people what the barriers are and identifying what those barriers are, I think there are some inferences that we can draw, because there are common correlations that are that we have seen for many years, and the link between socioeconomic status and, frankly, if you come from a poorer background, then you're less likely to have the good outcomes in life on a number of different dimensions, including health dimensions, and you're less likely to be active, and you're more likely to live in crowded environments, and therefore more susceptible to things like COVID and all of those things. And so we have to find ways to engage everyone, particularly from those sort of poor communities and underrepresented communities. And there's often a correlation between underrepresented or minority communities and coming from poorer backgrounds. I mean, in terms of things that have worked well in Greater Manchester, and not necessarily specifically for minority communities, but one thing that does seem to, as I understand it, seem to work quite well is the Daily Mile. And I think how we can use that and engage even more people in local communities, whether it's kids and grandparents going for a walk to the local shops for just once a day, and encouraging that connection in local communities. I think we need to think how we can engage those simple opportunities for movement using the local communities, but getting their views on what's the best way to do that.
So 2 great examples there in terms of both the Daily Mile and outdoor gyms and outdoor circuits that we've really seen as creating spaces for more people to be active. And it's great to hear you there, Paul, talk about Alex Park. That's my local park, so that has been the space that I've been to almost daily during lockdown and in recent months, and it has been it's been the picture when I have a vision of what active lives could look like in Greater Manchester. Alex Park has basically absolutely captured that in one, in terms of just the diversity of people doing a diversity of activities in a way that works for them. It has been absolutely phenomenal to see. And it's been great to see certainly the outdoor gyms and just the level of participation there. In the same way that you say there, Sanjay, how we keep it simple, design it in a simple way that works for everybody, and very much taking that person-centred approach that both of you refer to. So I can see why you're both such great ambassadors for greater sport, when we absolutely talk about, let's not make assumptions. Let's ask people. Let's start with what matters to you and make sure that we, as you say, go to source and recognise that it's, we all have different priorities, don't we? Different motivations, and the realities of our lives look very different. So is there anything else, just before we move on, anything else in particular that you'd want to highlight in terms of, is there any one particular challenge that you currently have in your mind that we think we should be, focusing on as a system in Greater Manchester in order to make progress, or anything else in particular that you want to highlight that we should be building on in making progress?
I would probably just say, thinking about what we've experienced over the last few months in the lockdown and COVID, and it's that old thing about the Chinese have the same word for crisis and opportunity, and clearly there's a crisis here, but where were the opportunities, and where have the opportunities that we've seen? So the way Manchester and many cities have responded is to make the infrastructure more amenable to cycling and movement. So how do we make that a more lasting change? I think that's one of those things that we should be thinking about and focusing on.
Absolutely. So the infrastructure and the changes around active travel and more broadly. Anything else, Paula, from you?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sandy. I think what I saw in lockdown in the early days was I have never seen so many people walking, jogging during their 1 hour, and I talked to all my neighbours. So that is the big positive. Even going down the steps on a Thursday clapping for the NHS, like literally I spoke to neighbours 3 doors down that I probably hadn't spoken to, and I'm sure a lot of other people in that same position. So I think because we had to stop, and we very rarely stop and actually stop and look and think. I think it just gave us that time to say, actually, we can do things differently, and maybe we should do things differently. I mean, I now walk to my local chemist, I walk to my local shop, things that I wouldn't have done pre-lockdown because it would take too much time. It's just kind of ridiculous because it took me that long time to park, find a space, park, go and do my shopping and get stressed out. So now I literally walk to things within 20 minutes of myself. So I think, like Sanjay said, there's some big positives, and hopefully people can make some minor changes. I mean, I've made the changes. I'm sure other people are. I know a lot more people are riding. So I think just observationally and anecdotally, you can see people that appear to be more active than they were in the past. And as Sanjay said, if you can cling on to some of those things, you can make some very slow changes, because it takes a long time to change behaviours, and it's not going to be a quick fix. But if we give people the space and the opportunity, I think we'll make some slight changes which can have a major impact long term.
So we really have seen walking and cycling go up the agenda, haven't they? Both from the government and, politically, but also in terms of people's day to day. As you say, far more people enjoying the joys of just having a local walk or jumping on a bike. And it has been good to see some of that is sticking. But again, how do we hold on to that? And recognise, you say, Paula, we're not going to change things overnight. It's a long haul, but continue to design that into life for all of us. And of course, the beauty of those is they don't cost anything, do they? Or the very low cost. So thinking again of the multiple layers really of the system, this whole system approach. And now we talked about infrastructure, and obviously big announcements from the government, from Boris, around cycling infrastructure, as well as prescribing cycling and all these things. And we have to keep applying an inequalities lens to each of these, don't we? Thinking, who do they work for and who don't they work for, and who was designing this, and what potential bias are they designing in, be that infrastructure or access or opportunity more broadly. So if we then think about picturing what we call our onion diagram, our whole system diagram that we use at Greater Sport, the next layer is really about organisations. So really thinking about those groups and organisations and the role that they have to play in supporting more active lives, and how important it is that they are then representative to and connected to, the diversity of people in our communities, and in particular then to people of colour who we know are underrepresented in policy making and boardrooms across the board. So are there any particular organisations who are really on the front line of this that you would be encouraging any of our partners that are listening to connect with, as we all sort of learn together and design the way forward?
Oh, that's a tough question. Sanjay, do you want to answer this?
If it's really difficult, you can go first.
Thank you, Sanjay. I was going to say, Sanjay, you're terrible. I was going to say, the reality, I don't think anybody does it very well. I think that's the truth. I think it would have been identified. I think companies that we presume do it very well have been shown actually they don't do it that well. So I think, me personally, is like, actually, this is where an organisation like Greater Sport is somewhere in the Northwest or Greater Manchester, we could take a lead in this. So because from the leadership up downwards, I've always been taught they set the culture and the vision and the values, and so it's got to come from the top. So that has got to be, they've got to have a vision, have a culture of inclusivity, and they've got to then live and breathe that, and then that's got to continue on and on and on. It can't flip and change, because then you lose people's hearts and minds, because they're like, well, you said this and now it's this. So it definitely comes from the top, setting a clear vision, that cultural change, not lip service, not a tick box exercise. If we say talking about real diversity, we're talking about, getting a real, a mixture of different people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities, sexualities and so forth, ages. Then you've got to actually demonstrate that, because unless it's demonstrated and people can look at it and see actually that is what we call a great system, then I think we'll probably always struggle. But I don't think anybody does it well. There's nobody I can say, actually, look at that organisation, they do it so well. Look at this business, look at this sport, because I just don't think anybody does it very well at the moment. But that's just my personal opinion.
I think the reason why we both find this a difficult question is because of the reasons that Paul has just set out. Because it's hard to think of an example of an organisation that does this really brilliantly. So in a way, the bad news for Greater Sport is there isn't like one organisation that does this brilliantly that we can copy. The good news is there's not one organisation that does this brilliantly that we have to copy. We have the opportunity to take a lead and to be more of a leader in our industry. I think there are some examples of some organisations that, for instance, are responding to Black Lives Matter quite well. I think most organisations have responded with a mixture of anger, confusion, or both, and then rushing for the high-profile, shiny initiative. I think some of the stuff that the FA are talking about doing, and maybe I would say this because I'm involved in it, but actually setting out, there's a 3-month program that we're going to do. We don't want it being longer than 3 months because it'll get kicked into the long grass. It's 3 months. We'll announce the targets on the 11th of October for the England-Belgium match, and that will be about setting targets for senior leadership and for coaches across the whole of football, because we recognise that this is not representative, and getting lots and lots of stakeholders in the working groups to be part of this program and to move really, really quickly. So I think, there's a good example of, right, we must move with speed but not haste. But I don't think there are really great examples anywhere around the country of people that are generally doing a great job around ethnic inclusion, either from a leadership perspective or from a participation perspective, where we can say, well, they're doing a particularly fantastic job. We've seen some good examples over the last few weeks of initiatives that have taken off. But whether they have taken off with ethnic inclusion in mind, I'm not sure. So I don't know, for example, Couch to 5K, which has been really big over the last few weeks. How much of that, how many people like me or Paula are engaged in that? And was there a specific plan to engage people like us in that? I don't know the answer to that, so that's not a rhetorical question. I just simply don't know.
Having that honest conversation I feel like we've had more of those just over the last few weeks. So in some sign of progress, I feel like I've been in more rooms where people are honestly going, do you know what? No one's got it right. and I like that phrase you use there, Sanjay, of move at speed but not haste. And I've really taken that from some of the conversations we've had all around this of, we've seen people rush, again, in response to Black Lives Matter quite recently, to wanting to think that there's a quick fix. And when you've got, racism is so systemic, it's so embedded, isn't it, in all our organisations, our ways of thinking, our ways of working, in the design of places, that we have to be honest around how long it takes to really dismantle that, but at the same time not wanting to then see that then nothing happens because people feel like it's too difficult or they can't see the change. So that feels like a really important point about how we move at speed but not haste, and be honest and have a long-term plan for how we really make progress and what we need to do here and now, to act now and not talk about it, and being honest feels hugely important in that, in all the conversations we have as we move forward. So thank you both for that, and certainly in terms of I know both of you have played a really important role for us in terms of sitting on the Greater Sport Board, and very practical examples can be we're currently recruiting for a new trustee, and to be able to come to yourselves and be able to go, okay, as we review our trustee recruitment processes, as we think about who we reach and how we reach and what the language is, what we're asking for, all those things. There's so many inherent biases in there, aren't there, that mean that they, some people they won't see it, and if they see it, they won't think it's for them. But we need to overcome to make sure that, as you say, we've got that vision and those values and that culture of change led from the top, and that we're living and breathing it. So thank you. In terms of, you both talked about some specific reflections on experiences during COVID, in terms of, I guess, some of the opportunities that you referred to that have come out of it, and more people spilling outside into outdoor gyms, for example, and walking and shifting around about cycling and infrastructure. I was reading some interesting data actually before this, which was suggesting that looking at young people in particular, and we keep trying to look at the intersecting barriers, so very much thinking, okay, in terms of looking at our Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities and recognising the multiple complexity of ethnicities within that, and then going, okay, what does that mean for age, what does that mean for other intersecting barriers potentially to activity. And for children and young people, the latest Sport England data was suggesting that for young people of colour, their levels of physical activity have increased during COVID in comparison to their white counterparts, which was news to me, because again, easily I think some of the headlines and some of the things I've read have suggested otherwise. I don't know if that's something that either of you aware of, or you've got any reflections on that, or any other reflections more broadly on, what we've learnt during COVID, what we've seen, and then what we want to take from that as we design and build back better for our Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities in Greater Manchester going forward.
So I hadn't seen that that data. I mean, it's really interesting, and I'd be interested to know why. If there are explanations as to why they think young Black and Asian people or young Black people are moving more than their white counterparts during lockdown. So it'd be really interesting to unpack that a little bit, because that sounds like there might be something there that we need to do in a more structured and studied way. So again, it's a little bit about the messages we've been talking about earlier about listening to our communities and understanding what's actually happening. Probably the biggest lesson for me during lockdown has been actually how mindful you have to be about movement, because if you're all sort of stuck indoors, actually that hour outside of exercise can be very often the highlight of the day. I'd just be interested to know again if we've got any data on who has been moving more, whether that has had an impact on different communities in different ways. Certainly when I wander around, I see more Black and Asian faces where I live than I thought lived here or were around. And so it's quite interesting going for a walk in the woods where I live, and when I'm driving down the streets, I didn't see as many people, but actually when I'm walking through the woods here where I live, I'm seeing far more people. So that's maybe it's because I'm now walking around with my eyes open, which I wasn't before. I don't know.
Any reflections from you, Paula?
Yeah, I think it's really, what's really actually with Sanjay said that, I actually agreed with him, because I think I just walked around and was kind of focused on my own self. But when you have that hour a day, you kind of look around and your phone's not ringing, you're not distracted. And I saw a lot more people of, Black and Asian, other minorities where I live that I hadn't seen before, just walking around. And so I actually think that 1 hour, it actually gave people a purpose, because you can't stay in house all day. And so your hour became quite precious. So I actually think most people actually took advantage of that hour. I know some of my friends who were not the most active definitely went out for their 1 hour a day. And I know some of my close friends did the couch to 5K as well. And I think for obviously for some, and I can't speak for everybody, but for some people of colour, from the BAME background, I think the fact that it was highlighted that COVID was more, the rates of infection and the rates of death was higher in our groups. It was obviously probably a bit of a wake-up call as well. To be fair, and I think Sanjay would also probably understand this, when they started showing the pictures of the people that were dying from the health service and the general population, I said to my husband, who is white, there seems to be a lot of people who were Black and minorities dying, and he thought I was being a bit sensitive. And I was like, every time I'd switch on the TV, and it went on for about 2 weeks before somebody else mentioned it, and then the government mentioned it, and initially there was like, no, there's no issues, and then 6 weeks later there was. So but if you spoke to any Black person or person of colour before that, they would have said, yeah, absolutely, you just look at what's being put in front of your TV every day, and the deaths were so high. So I think the positive side that it probably kind of struck a little bit more, and we're like, actually we do need to think of our health. There is that high level of diabetes, blood pressure, so forth in our communities that we do know anyway. So part of me thinks that probably might have motivated more people that weren't moving to get moving, and people that were moving to make sure they continued moving. That's just me thinking aloud, and it could be totally wrong, but yeah, I think people were struck initially that, before it was confirmed, that a lot of us were actually succumbing to this unfortunate disease.
Some really interesting thoughts there around, again, our kind of our perceptions and what we see and what we kind of assumptions that we make are often informed, aren't they, by all the knowledge that you had in that scenario, where absolutely you were right in terms of disproportionate impact on people of colour of COVID. But then how important it is that then we have the data to be able to go, so that it can't be dismissed as being just your perception. Yeah. That we have the data that goes alongside that kind of qualitative information of us asking people what the barriers are for them, of seeing it, of what we are, when we walk out of the house, who do we see, and does that match the data when it feels like, and I share your experience, when I walk out of my door in Wally Range, I feel like I have seen far more people from Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, and some from very specific communities, far more from the Somalian community, who I know absolutely live on my doorstep, but I hadn't seen in the same numbers within the park as I have over the recent week. But then being able to go, well, is that a reality? Is that just my experience
Exactly.
day, because I'm being mindful and I'm seeing something different, because we have our own bias built in? What has been a real challenge is we don't have the data in Greater Manchester or across the UK. We don't have good enough disaggregated data that really tells us what the picture is when it comes to particularly our Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities and the different ethnicities within that. And that does feel like what's been revealed as a very gaping hole that I think, the three of us would have already been able to point to, but that really needs addressing so that we can make sure that we use that as evidence-led in terms of what we do, and that we can unpack it when we have the data, like say Sanjay there, when that was surprising for me to suggest that there's been a greater increase of physical activity in that instance of young people of colour, and to then go, well, what is that about, and what can we learn from that, and what can we take forward? And that sense of the mindfulness, I think it's really interesting. It made me reflect certainly on going out over lockdown. I would say I was local a lot of the time, but probably not as much as I have been, and how many of us have just spent more time in our local neighbourhoods, and how important could that be in terms of our understanding of our local communities and connection with local communities. I've certainly been out at different times of the day than I probably would have been previously when I would have been at work and out during the day. So I see different people at different points. So there's lots, isn't there to learn around our connection to people and place as well. So lots to talk about, reflect, that we can take forward. So just on a final note, really, then, with any particular ways that you've adapted or had to adapt in terms of the way you move and the way that your work to support others to keep moving, particularly people of colour during COVID, and anything in particular that you want to hold on to in this new norm?
And I think what I'm going to definitely hold on to is that I'm still walking, which is good, using the car less. Because all the gyms were shut, I actually got a little gym outside in our garden. We were fortunate that we have got a garden, so we've got like a little circuit set up. So I'm going to continue doing that. I will go back to the gym, but I'm not in a mad rush because I'm actually in a nice routine. In terms of the general community, I think information is knowledge. So I think that came out about the obesity rates and, about supermarkets and food and so forth. But I think give people the information and then give them the tools to come up with a program that suits them, whether it's walking, whether it's swimming, whether it's going to the local park and doing outdoor gyms. I think information is power. So I would always say, give them the true information and give them then the support to put any plans they want to do into action. And generally it's going to be local, and generally it's going to be low cost. I always presume. So yeah, I think myself, I'm just embrace lockdown and we're coming out of it, and I'm just going to try and hold on to all the positive things that we did during lockdown and keep them going.
Sounds good to me.
Actually, my views are quite similar in some ways. I mean, in terms of how I move and how has lockdown changed me, actually, it goes back to that mindfulness, which is, what did I think I liked? What I thought I liked was going to the gym. My wife's a Pilates instructor. We have a gym upstairs, but I like to go to a personal trainer because I like being pushed. Because if I'm left to my own devices, I'll be lazy and I'll work within myself. What I didn't realise was how much I valued, in between all my meetings and being in town and traveling and stuff, was actually all the walking that I do in between meetings and time to just decompress between meetings and to chat over coffee or just do something else in my day, and the changes of scenery, and actually it's replacing everything with a Zoom call and then doing it all back to back. You don't have any of that decompression time, and you can so easily slip into having 8 hours of Zoom calls and not being physically active. And then I look at my step tracker and I realise my activity is way, way, way down, not just a little bit down, but way down on where it would normally be. And so I've had to do some personal being mindful about changing things. So I'll only have a morning of Zoom or afternoon of Zoom. I won't have both. and I'll do something else with my time for the other half of my day. Because actually in the real world, I would only have had 3 or 4 hours of meetings and other stuff in between. I wouldn't have been doing 8 hours of meetings. That's just exhausting. So I think being a bit more mindful about how I structure my day, because I've got lots of time, or lots more time than I used to have, I don't want to waste it. And actually 8 hours of meetings is a waste of a day because I'm not getting the balance in my day. In terms of, more generally, what lessons do we take for society as a whole? I suppose hopefully for society as a whole, we could be that little bit more mindful. I don't know what it's been like for other people, but when I sit in the garden, I notice things now which I probably wouldn't have. Because I was mindful of things, and how can we use things like the technology to get to people individually? So we see the success of things like Couch to 5K, and we're probably in this COVID world for the next 12 months or so. So it's never going to be, not for the foreseeable, are we going to go back to anything that was a pre-COVID normal? So how do we reach individuals using the technology? And I think how we embrace that technology to get to people and to understand how they're moving and to deliver things that they want in a challenging way. So I think things like Couch to 5K and creating those little challenges that everyone can do are probably a really big way forward for the whole industry.
I imagine there's lots in there that listeners has resonated with listeners. I've certainly spoken to lots of people, myself included, Sanjay, who are trying to look at how to better design and structure our day so we don't spend up to 12 hours on Zoom, and design moving into that day. Definitely for that decompressing. It was always I'd get on my bike in between meetings, and turning of the wheels enabled the kind of cogs in my head really to turn, and I definitely missed that space. So some great enablers there as well around thinking about tech, which are absolutely seen as an enabler have been in recent weeks, and enabling people to move within their homes or within a space that they're safe to be in. And also thinking then around social networks, so how important it is that the people that we're with creating those norms. For example, like saying it's okay to say no to another Zoom meeting. It's good to say I'm limiting the number of Zoom meetings I have to 3 hours a day because my mental health, my physical health is important, and I need to also move. And how easily we could slip into a culture potentially where we have this opportunity to be travelling less, but actually we end up using that by sitting in front of the screen more. So it feels like some very conscious, intentional design that we need to do now, in that new norm, and how we all kind of encourage each other to do that. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and really grateful for both of your time and contributions there. So I hope there's lots there for people listening in. So take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you're interested in reading some of the data we spoke about during the podcast, head to the Research and Insight section of the Greater Sport website at greatersport.co.uk. We're really keen to collaborate with other organisations and partners to jointly promote anti-racism work in sports and physical activity, to magnify good practice, amplify underrepresented voices, and to take systemic action to dismantle structural inequalities to help improve the lives of our communities. If you're interested in working with us on our journey as an organisation and in building an inclusive movement for movement, please get in touch. You can email me at eve@gmmoving.co.uk. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, goodbye, take care, and keep moving.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not share it or tell a friend about it? And if you've got feedback or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch with our team at Greater Sport using the links that you'll find on our podcast page.